Hello, I'm Pastor Hilly. Thank you for joining us for Faith Lutheran Church's Adult Forum series. We're calling this episode The Great Beyond. But before we get to our special guest this week, a brief reminder that during this time of social distancing, there is wonderful ministry coming out of the community that we call Faith Lutheran Church in Whitehall, Ohio. Ministry that includes this very podcast. If you would like to support the ministry of faith financially, please find the link labeled Giving in the description below. And now, on to our topic. Joining me today is Dr. Nathan Jackson, who is currently serving as Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Capital University. Dr. Jackson, thank you so much for being part of our conversation today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I'm very excited about this.
How is this socially distant life treating you and yours?
You know, I think we're enjoying it. There's a lot of togetherness, which is good. Yeah, like it's been interesting working from home, being with kids, doing school at home, all of that. You know, going out and seeing everyone wear masks, like it's a little disconcerting as a Midwesterner because we can't like smile at each other awkwardly. So, you know, it's an adjustment. We're all making it.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true. So today, what our aim is, and what we're going to try to tackle, or at least talk around in some way, is the history of thought as it relates to the topic of the afterlife. And I feel like before we even get to this, I always, in this conversation, make the point that whenever any of us are discussing the afterlife, a big part of that is like trying to describe a color that has never been seen, you know?
Right.
Because as soon as you say, well, it's kind of like red, then someone can say, oh, you mean pink. And when it comes to the afterlife, we're talking about something that none of us have ever been to the side. So I don't think we even have the language to put together descriptions of things that are so far out of our reality. But yeah, we still like to have these conversations.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So it's pretty clear we're not going to have, you know, some experiential account of, right, the afterlife. Like I certainly haven't had that near-death experience. Right. And we'll do our best to sort of put together the various, you know, thoughts from different traditions and sort of test them for coherence and sort of look for places where maybe our common conception of the afterlife, you know, doesn't have all the parts that kind of fit together.
I mean, that's very true. If you and I were to sit here and spitball, you know, what is the afterlife or the afterlife process, the transition, if you will, based on common culture at the time, we're going to see a lot of complexities and dueling ideologies, whether we want to admit that or not.
Right.
You know, it's you know, do when we die, do we turn into angels? There's that text in Matthew where Jesus says you will be like the angels, and it's like being like something is not the same as being that thing.
Right.
You know, does that change happen to our real bodies? Does it happen to our spiritual bodies? When we die,
yeah, what is a spiritual body, right? Like even that concept is vague, right? That is difficult to describe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so sort of seeing where we might have, you know, kind of different ideas floating around about like transitions and the kinds of things that we might become, and then what does it mean sort of to be a self and have a personality, right, continuing into an afterlife. Yeah, there are all kinds of issues here.
Huge. And we'll break these down as we continue, but I think that a lot of this complexity we have, especially as Christians in the West in the 21st century, is that our understanding of the afterlife is rooted in this evolution of thought that dates back 3,000 years, you know? And so we can't just pick it up on face value right now and go with it. But it does take a little exploration to figure out how we got here and those forces that are at play. And so if we understand that Christianity began as a Jewish reform popping up in Hellenistic areas during the first century, then what we kind of need to look at is both the Old Testament understanding of the afterlife, which changes from book to book, as well as Greek thought and mythology to get us to the cocktail where we are.
Right. Right. And what a cocktail it is.
What a cocktail it is.
So yeah, I think tracing that development is going to be important to try and see what we can pick out of the Tanakh, the Torah, and then see how that's going to develop in like different ways, being inflected by particularly like Paul's appreciation for Greek philosophy, right, and trying to fit sort of one tradition on top of another.
Right.
And then we have our own sort of, cultural predilections that affect how we're going to interpret that as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So, all right, let's flip a coin. Do we want to start, let's say, Odyssey, or do we want to try to start Torah?
Yeah, I'm gonna like defer to you on the Torah for the most part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we should start Odyssey. I think we should start
all right,
Odyssey.
I'm going to start the Odyssey.
I mean, and if for no other reason, then tradition says that the Torah dates back to 1312 BC, but dating and other academic pursuits put it somewhere between the 6th century and 4th century BC, where the Odyssey goes back to what, 8th century, around 700s.
Yeah, that seems right.
Yeah.
Right, which is still several hundred years before Greek philosophers are talking.
Yeah, yeah. So like let's start there. When we're looking at the Odyssey.
Yeah.
Speaking of going on an Odyssey.
It's all good. Yeah, so we're looking at the Odyssey.
Yeah. So can you kind of frame for us a little bit the understanding of the afterlife, or the engagement of the afterlife, or the underworld? Like, where do we see that kind of exist, or how do we see that framed in the Odyssey?
All right, so in the Odyssey, I think we see it framed best when we have Odysseus, right, the hero of the Odyssey, who's on the 10-year journey home from the Trojan War after like pissing off Poseidon. Right, it takes a bit. Seeing and visiting the shade of Achilles, right? Yep. Right, who's the hero from the Iliad, right? So you have the two epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Odysseus is the hero of the Odyssey. It's about a journey home. Achilles is the hero of the Iliad. It's about the victory at Troy, right? And this is kind of an interesting setup, right? So before we even talk about like what a shade is and like that one could go visit them, which is itself pretty interesting. Homer, the author of both these epic poems, seems to present like the reader of both with a kind of choice, right? Achilles and Odysseus are very different characters. They're both heroic. Achilles dies for glory in battle, and right, that's one vision of sort of like the epic heroic life is like death on the battlefield and glorious victory, like sacrifice to this greater cause. And then Odysseus, who is like going home to like rule and live up to his civic obligation and his obligation to the family. And in Homer, right, these are two sort of competing visions of what it might be to live a good life. And if you sort of look at the text as a whole, you can't get both, right? So it's one or the other. That conversation comes up as Odysseus meets Achilles' shade, right? So the question is about regret, right? Does Achilles regret his decision to, become famous, right, by dying in the battlefield. And it seems like he does, right? Like
Yeah.
when he's describing his experience as, you know, being dead, he would have preferred, right, to sort of live a humble life and to have spent his time, right, being at home with a family, sort of living up to civic and familial obligation. Um, so there's a couple of things here that are kind of interesting. One, Achilles, the hero, is not like loving the afterlife, right? This isn't a great experience for him. He's not saying that this sort of swamps every other good thing that would have happened in his life, um, right? Because like the choice is like you're here and dead, or you're at home with like your wife and kids,
Right.
and he would prefer being at home with his wife and kids. Um, right? So one, it's not this like perfect, amazing experience that like just dwarfs everything else. So that's a big thing. A second thing that's happening here is that through, some sort of mythological frameworks and storytelling, um, Achilles, the shade, right, the dead guy,
Yep.
is the kind of thing that can actually interact with the living. Um, right? So Odysseus can go and visit Achilles. They're interacting in a place, they can actually talk to one another. Right? Like the life of the shade, right? The dead person is not fundamentally sort of different and distinct and totally cut off from the life of, Odysseus, the at that point still living guy.
Right. Because I'm trying to remember in Homer's framework in the Odyssey, are we given a glimpse into multiple afterlives? Is there like the good one or the bad one? I think later on in Virgil, there's the bad option, and then there are the fields, right? The fields of Elysium, I think, but as Virgil writes.
Yeah, so you have the Elysian fields,
Right.
right, that sort of like exist outside of Hades,
Mhm.
right, which is where all the noble pagans go, right, because they can't be saved, uh, what with the being pagan,
Yep.
uh, but they were, decent people, and you don't want to throw like the philosophers, or at least all of them, in hell. So they have to go somewhere. So they just kind of like get to hang out outside of Hades, uh, doing what they were doing anyway, right? They just sort of continue being intellectuals and noble pagans. They're just not allowed in heaven.
Right. So with um with
Homer. So the question was like, does Homer give us multiple, like, is there a
yeah,
good place? Is there a bad place? Um, yeah, so I don't have the Odyssey in front of me, and it's been years. I don't know if it's specifically in Homer, but in Greek mythology, there are sort of better and worse versions.
right, no, absolutely. But I
Uh,
think we get those later on in the Odyssey.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can be thrown in like Tartarus,
Yeah.
right, which is sort of either a place or a being of eternal torment, basically.
Yeah.
um right, and you don't want to end up there. So don't, I don't know, kill your children. And then, right, the better option is to just kind of be a shade in Hades, right, where you're existing in some way, but you're not sort of dealing with this sort of proto version of hell.
Yeah. Yeah. And so to again think about our bigger timeline, to know that the Odyssey has already been making rounds prior to our completed version of the Torah, One of
Hmm.
the things that's really interesting is that in Deuteronomy and later on in Second Kings, as well as other places in the Old Testament, there are very, very clearly written parts of the law that are against necromancy, against speaking to the dead, against
Yeah,
summoning up shades. So there's a cultural awareness of that practice, because if it wasn't an issue, there wouldn't be a rule against it.
exactly. It's like when my hometown made a law against public urination. Like
Yeah, if it
someone did
wasn't
it,
an
and now we
issue.
have to have a law.
Exactly. Um, so to kind of like dovetail this into a Torah understanding of death and the afterlife, the idea is that you die and you're buried, and you kind of wait in this Sheol,
Yeah,
and that there everyone is waiting until the coming of the Messiah and the last day and the perfection that comes in that moment,
right.
right? And again, not a great place, not a bad place. It's just kind of like sitting at John Glenn. We're
Yep. We're
yeah,
just here.
yeah, we're hanging out in the and depending on especially which of the prophets you're reading, um, it could be just like you're asleep. You're asleep until you're not asleep, and when you're not asleep, boom, you know.
Yeah.
So even the that sense of waiting, I think it might be our projection onto this kind of post-life reality.
Yeah, I don't think in Greek mythology we have this idea that there's going to be some large cataclysmic event, right, in the future,
Right.
um, right, which like fundamentally sort of ends the waiting wherever it is that that we're waiting for. Like if you're a shade, you're just a shade. That's what we're doing, right, and this is how your like afterlife is. Now like certainly there are other traditions and different mythologies where there is some like cataclysmic event like in the future, because the Marvel movies, like everyone's sort of familiar with Ragnarok, right? Like the idea in Norse mythology is that there would be some like giant final battle where everything was just destroyed and that was the end, right? Like
Mm.
so you waited for that and then it's done. There's nothing after that, right? The world starts over.
And I think that this is kind of telegraphing where this is going to end in terms of our conversation. And we've already touched on this. Um, as we see Christianity coming up as this Jewish reform and Hellenistic era, what we're seeing is 1,000 years of two schools of thought that are kind of like rubbing up against one another. On one
Yeah.
end, you die and it is what it is. And in the other one, you die and we wait, and then there's the last judgment. There's the final coming. So what we see is these two individual streams kind of coming together.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, especially when we think about modern Christianity, where people kind of assume, well, you die, and after you die, you either go up or down, or the angel thing. But then we also still have to have the final judgment. So do
Yeah,
we
so we're
do?
both waiting and done, right?
Yeah,
Which is going to be like that is a tension, right? To kind of hold into in one's conception of the afterlife, right? Um, I think popularly we think you're dead, you go one place or the other, and then right, we kind of forget about the final judgment, or we bring up the final judgment, right? When we say the creeds and kind of gloss over that,
right.
right?
And I think that the use of the afterlife being something I have to wait on later down the road versus the afterlife being something that happens at the moment that I die. If we look at, if we go back to the Old Testament, based on whether we're talking pre-exilic, exilic, or post-exilic,
Yeah,
like there's a much different kind of need to understand God's faithfulness that we see kind of go through this lens of the afterlife, right? Because if I'm born and raised, or if I die in exile, or I'm in that moment, why was it worth it if I'm just going to die and then wait indiscriminately until the last judgment comes?
right.
Whereas if the theology changes, I'm like, oh well, good and faithful servant, you were here during captivity, you're here in exile, and when you die, you get your Happy Meal toy right there.
Yeah, it's done.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very different experience, very different context.
Yeah, asking people in a good position to wait is one thing. Asking people who are actively suffering to prolong that, and you have to shift that around a little bit.
Yeah.
In the place where people are. A few other things I think is interesting, just kind of like touching on Old Testament things and the idea of punishment. It's a really weird path that gets us here. On the, I believe it's southeast side of Jerusalem, there was a field. Oh, I forget the name of its name translates to the field of so-and-so. Anyway, the field was used by the prophets and followers of the god Molech, and in their belief, you sacrificed your firstborn child by burning them alive, and that was part of the priest of Molech. Like that was part of that religion.
That's not great.
No, it's horrible, and
Yeah.
so this field was seen as just bad land because children were being sacrificed by these foolish people who would do this sort of thing. And so when you jump to the New Testament and, Jesus says it's better to cut off your hand than to stumble, or else, you'll end up in, lake of fire, those kind of texts.
Yeah.
It's directly pointing to a community in the Old Testament or in modern day Jerusalem at the time, that everyone knew that those were the in for a penny, in for a pound, right? If you start sinning in little ways, you'll continue down the bad road, and then you will end up doing
you'll sin big.
Yeah. But so you take that idea and then you blend that in with this idea of the afterlife, to circle back around to a comment that you made. And then if you are a shade, if we talk about what is a spiritual body, and suddenly we have this image of a lake of fire. Well, I guess that spiritual body or whatever it is going to be stuck in that lake of fire.
It's just kind of hanging out there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we're just piecing together stuff from like different aspects of the tradition, right? And multiple traditions.
Yeah. So let's talk. Let's get in your wheelhouse. Let's talk Socrates.
I appreciate that. I'm going to shut the door again real quick.
Yeah, man.
Awesome. Woo! All right, Socrates.
So Socrates was a big guy. The body is what it is. It's broken. It's flawed. The big thing is the soul, and when you die, your soul moves on.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So, body and soul are different things. Right? The soul is eternal. Can't be destroyed. It's not really created either, so it pre-exists the body for Socrates. Right? So harm to the body is not necessarily harm to one's actual being, right? The soul is what matters. Right? So trying to think familiarity with Socrates. So Socrates gets this reputation as the father of Western philosophy. He's this guy who sort of walks around Athens and talks to people in various positions of authority and power, right? So he'll talk to poets about art. He'll talk to priests about the nature of piety. Right? He'll talk to generals about the nature of courage and how you educate courage. The basic structure of the Platonic dialogues, where we sort of encounter Socrates, is that Socrates gets these people to articulate their assumptions and then to articulate objections to their own assumptions. So it's a really annoying activity, right? Because you think you know something, you say what you think you know, Socrates just prods you with some questions, And by the end of the conversation, you realize you didn't actually know the thing that you thought you did, right? So the priest doesn't know about piety, the generals don't actually know about courage, and the poets don't actually know about beauty. And this is a good way to tick people off, and he did. So he was tried for impiety and corrupting the youth.
Yeah.
Those were the two things that were brought against him. He was found guilty. Really wonderful dialogue where you sort of read Plato's sort of version of the trial of Socrates called the Apology. It's very fun. Um, and then he is sentenced to death by drinking hemlock.
Mhm.
And there are a few dialogues about the sort of experiences around the death of Socrates. Um, and here we get uh, some philosophy about the nature of the soul, the afterlife, in relation to the body. Yeah. So that's the quick overview.
Right, right.
We can go into a little bit more detail as on what he actually thinks, right, about the soul and the body.
So with him, right, we're talking about the soul and the body as two different things, right?
Yep.
And so, all right, let's talk about the kind of the hybrid understanding of punishment, like Lake of Fire style. For Socrates, you die, your body dies, your soul, which pre-exists, continues, and then it's its own thing, right? And are they
Yeah.
the different substances, I would have to assume?
Yeah, so they're different things. So in the Phaedo, which is sort of the dialogue that's most concerned with sort of showing the immortality of the soul. Um, right, there's something called the likeness or the resemblance argument,
Mhm.
where he asks questions about, what is the soul more like? Is it like the unchanging things, or is it more like changing things? Is the body more like changing things, or is the body more like unchanging things? Um, and the body's pretty clearly like changing things, right? Like you grow, uh, you get sick, yeah, you might get injured, you just get old, right? And the body like changes. The body is not like a stable thing, right? And so like the body is more like the changeable things that you kind of see, right? So, you know, uh, you go look at the Scioto River and it's insanely high right now. It's changing. It's still flowing, right? You look at buildings, they're changing. You look at animals, the natural world, all that stuff, right? It's changing. Physical stuff changes. And then there's this sort of series of questions about like the nature of the soul. Is the nature of the soul more like the changing things, right? Or is it more like the unchanging things? And Socrates wants to say it's more like the things that don't change, things like number, right? It's like the concept two has not changed, right? It's still the same concept. Even before people recognized it as a concept,
Yep.
like it two was two. Things like the equal, right? For two things to be equal, that doesn't change. Like the very concept stays the same, right? And is stable, like all the way back, right?
Yeah.
And all the way forward on into eternity. Um, so the soul for Socrates is more like the unchanging things.
Right.
Now, the dialogue is going to continue. That's not his final argument. The interlocutors, Simmias, Sebes, right, others, they're going to say that's not a knockdown argument,
Right.
right, for the immortality of the soul. So he's going to offer some more, right? But it's kind of the basic framework. There are two kinds of things. There are things that change and things that don't change. Bodies are in the camp of the things that change, and then souls, right, are in the camp of the things that don't change, right? Like I can't get into an accident and lose my soul arm.
Right.
That's not going to happen.
But that raises a question. If you are in an accident and you lose your normal arm, when your soul transitions, does the arm come back?
All right, we're gonna come back to that. So, for Socrates, right, it's not as though you're gonna like wander around having a body, at least not in the Phaedo, right? So we'll talk about the Republic and the myth at the end of that in a second. Right, like it's not clear that you just sort of wake up and now you are like a mostly translucent sort of version of your physical self, right? Like
Right.
that's not happening. The point is, like, your soul, when your body died, got to go out and like hang out with like the very like real eternal concepts of things like the good, the beautiful, the just, right? And got to like enjoy this kind of like presence with what he called the forms, right? These like real universals. So you could actually like interact and be with, right, like goodness itself,
Right.
which is not like an embodied thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and that makes sense because on the other hand, right, one of the questions could be, then why do we have such a predilection toward this idea that my soul looks like myself, just transparent, right? And I think that we need that whenever we're trying to wrestle with the idea of, let's say, justice, right? Like, or the back end of theodicy, right? Like good
Yeah.
things to good people, bad things to bad people. Because if my soul or if my afterlife me is embodiment of me in some way, then it can be punished for the bad things and, like go up or down. However, if
Yeah.
it's a vague concept, it takes away our ability to disperse retribution in our own minds,
Yeah.
thinking about the other people.
I think that's right. And I think there's like, so this tension exists in Greek philosophy as well regarding the relationship between the body and a soul, or what we might call a form. So for Socrates and his well, what we think of Socrates as far as we get him through his student Plato,
Yep.
right? The soul is like its own thing, it's distinct, it's real substance. Right? It exists eternally, it's unchanging. When you die, like the form, the soul of you goes and enjoys sort of presence with like these real universals, truth, beauty, justice, goodness, etc. And like the body just kind of falls away. It's not really real, it's not really important.
Mhm.
And we have this kind of tendency to kind of overvalue the embodied things. So real quick, like in the Phaedo, like Socrates' point is that philosophy is good preparation for death, which I enjoy, because philosophy is the task of trying to think about the definition of like the good, the just, the beautiful. And so philosophers are supposed to be less invested in their body than other people, right?
Right.
So their soul is sort of better prepared to go and like, you know, do the afterlife. All right. However, there is another Greek philosopher. He's Plato's student, Aristotle. And Aristotle is really, really different from Plato. For Aristotle, um, for me to be a thing, I need both matter, what we might think of as like my body, like the stuff that makes up my body,
Right.
and form, right? So the form is like the recipe that makes me me, right? So I'm more than just like a pile of stuff, right? I am informed matter.
Okay.
And you need both, right? In order to be a thing. So the fancy term for this is a hylomorphic compound.
Okay.
Um, right? But the basic idea is there's no you without a body. And the way Christianity picks this up, there's no you without a soul and a body,
Mm.
right? So we need to be able to talk about a body if we're Aristotle or Aristotelian in some way, in order to be able to talk about existing at all, right, in the afterlife. So where Plato and Socrates are going to say like the soul, it's immaterial, it's unchanging, right? It exists before the body, it exists after the body, and then it just sort of goes on and enjoys life with the forms, whatever that looks like, and we can't describe it because all of our language is going to be embodied.
Yeah.
If we're Aristotelian and we want to say there's an afterlife, we have to say that there's a body in the afterlife,
Yeah.
right?
And so if we look at that timeline and we're going Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, then
Yeah.
even further after that, we have Virgil writing, because Virgil's writing, right around 29 to 19 BC. And so he's kind of growing up in there writing in this post-Aristotelian world, which is why in his afterlife, you have a little bit more of that kind of like embodied good and bad in a much more flushed out way than we got from Homer.
Exactly. There have to be bodies, right?
Yeah.
For Aristotle. And so, yeah, and we see different ways in which this gets picked up in Christianity, right? We believe in the resurrection of the body.
Yep.
Like, well, why? Well, in part because we're shaped by Aristotelian philosophy where, like, if it's just immaterial souls floating around, we don't even exist. There's not even a thing to talk about.
Yeah. And I mean, thinking about the words of the creed, the emphasis on the resurrection of the body there, like supports so much of our theology of the importance of Easter, right?
Yeah.
Thomas goes, I won't believe until I put my hands in his hole, the holes of his hands, that sort of thing. The reality of on the road to Emmaus, Jesus appears, walks with them, sits at the table and breaks bread. Like all of these very physical things to try to make that claim that it wasn't just a shade or a hallucination or whatever the case may be.
Right.
Right.
That it's real.
Yeah. Which is, just a fascinating reality when we look at the history of where Christianity is coming out of and the cultures that are impacting those communities so strongly.
Yeah.
And I think that something else that's going on when we cross over to the AD or Common Era, there's let's call it the eschatological time signature of the Gospels versus the epistles. So for Jesus, Jesus is on the cross. He says to the thieves next to him, today you will be with me in heaven. There's this very reality, my hour has come when the kingdom of man comes. John 14, the many mansions text, I've come to take you there. Like, we're going. There's no need to wait. Like, the end is coming and it'll happen right now. I don't think the gospel writers give us a long-term plan for anything because that's not how they were writing.
Right.
Where Paul talks a lot more about patience and that virtue of patience and kind of giving us that framework for understanding, all right, it might not end right now, but that doesn't mean we're stopping the race. We're just keeping it going on a longer game, right? And so if the end is coming now, then we don't have to ask the question, oh, well, what happens when I die? Because I'll die when the end comes.
Yep.
So it's not an issue, but with Paul, it's giving us a little bit of, again, it creates that issue that suddenly we have to talk about. Okay, well, what happens when I die? And what do we do with the difference in time between the moment I die and the resurrection of the dead? And if grandma died 40 years ago and the resurrection happens 200 years from now, and I die right now and the resurrection's 200 years from now, does grandma get 40 extra years of being an angel or whatever it is?
Right.
Yeah. Or, because people love jumping on the whole, like the wheat and the chaff and separating the goat from the sheep and that sort of thing. So if at the moment of death, we go either up or down. It's kind of this weird staging, and we can talk about like the realities of purgatory and Dante and that sort of thing in a minute. Um, but like, how does the system work? Where okay, I've already died, I've already gone to heaven, I'm already an angel, and now the judgment's coming. Is that like a peer review? Like, do I have to go back up? Do I lose my spot if they're like, oh, you actually weren't as good as we thought the first time?
Right. Um, yeah. So, I mean, you sort of lose the motivation for a final event
Yeah.
if everyone's already like in the place where like they, have been judged to be, right? Or where they like deserve to be. Um, so this is one of like the small sort of like puzzles we have. Like, are we waiting, right? Or are we just kind of done? Um, right? It seems like we have a lot of different sort of pieces of philosophy kind of working here, right? For Socrates, like in the Phaedo at least, like it seems like you're just done, right? It seems like the soul goes and it hangs out with the forms and it gets to enjoy that, and it's easier for philosophers than for other people.
Mhm.
Um, right? Other people, it takes a little bit more like, you know, stress to kind of like get used to not being embodied.
Yeah.
Right? So it seems like some people might have to undergo a kind of transition. Um, I think one thing that shows up in Plato that's interesting, um, that's definitely distinct from Christianity, but like maybe in some way uh, speaks to this kind of difference. Or maybe I just hope it does because I want to talk about it. Hakim's having fun in the background. Let me shut the door one more time. Woo! So at the end of the Republic, which is, if you're going to read one work by Plato, you know, don't read the Republic because it's long as hell. Right? Read the Apology. It's much more fun. Right? There's something called the myth of right? Uh, so we've come to the end of this book. Plato's described the perfect city. It should be ruled by philosophers. You might have noticed now we have like two arguments for why philosophy is awesome. Philosophers do this all the time. We're not to be trusted. Uh, like the question is like, how do we sort of remember from before our birth, right? What the good, the just, and the beautiful are, right? Socrates thinks we know these things because our soul pre-exists our body.
Mhm.
So how's that supposed to work? And Socrates tells us this story. So there's this guy, and he dies, and then he has this experience where like the lives are judged, and on the basis of like the things you did and how like decent or not decent you were in life, your afterlife goes sort of better or worse. So like the tyrants and the people who commit like the most heinous crimes, they end up just sort of in Tartarus forever, right? Never to return to a body. People who are just kind of like mildly bad spend a fair amount of time in Tartarus, and they eventually get out, right? And so on and so forth, right? So your actions and virtue on Earth impact your experience in the afterlife. Um, and then once you're done, serving your time, doing your thing, you kind of get released, and you're going to go back into a body. So you have to make this journey, and apparently on this journey, you get like super thirsty. Um, you know, it's a thing because it's like a death desert. And it's not like there's like a whole bunch of water, like you have a flask for the 10,000 years you just spent in Tartarus. Uh, so you get to the end of that, um, and you are presented with different lives you might live, right? And so like more virtuous people will pick better lives.
Mhm.
And then before you're embodied again, right? So you're going to live multiple lives on earth. You have to like drink from this fountain. And the more you drink, the less you'll remember from your experience being dead. And the less you drink, the more you'll remember from your experience being dead. So the wise people drink less, even though they're thirsty, because they think there are important lessons from their time being dead. And then the unwise people, the sort of like invirtuous, intemperate people, just, inhale this water, and then they don't remember squat. And they tend to be, they're going to be vicious people, right? Because they don't remember these lessons. So here, you get this picture, like the afterlife involves waiting, right? But you're kind of waiting to make another round, right? You're going to kind of continually come back in various ways. What we see in particularly like popular Christianity, you're sort of simultaneously waiting for the final event, but you're waiting for a final event in the place where you're supposed to end up.
Right.
Right? Which is a little bit problematic. Right? And I mean, I think there are a host of other really interesting questions um, about that, right? So, in particular, let's say I died, and then like I'm supposed to go to heaven, right? Let's say I made it, um, you know, foot of the cross and all that. I'm covered. Okay, well, I'm supposed to be in heaven, and this is supposed to be like a good thing. Um, like I know me really well, and like I like certain things, like I like hanging out, watching Netflix, I like eating too much, right? Um, I have various vices that I'm probably not going to enjoy uh as I am like hanging out with, God and the heavenly hosts. Like I'm pretty sure they're not going to be like, "Hey, you should eat an entire frozen pizza by yourself. That's cool. You earned it for that one time you did something nice."
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, right? Like I'm supposed to enjoy the presence of God and the heavenly host.
Mhm.
Um, that requires that I'm like kind of a different person,
Yep. Yep.
right? Um, and so there's this question about like if I just go to heaven, right? Like would I even recognize myself um as the type of person who would, flourish, right? Or enjoy um, you know, hanging out with God and the heavenly host and all of that, right? Which is not to say it's going to be a bad experience.
Right.
What it is to say is that like the me I know right now, right, has a bunch of like character issues that are going to make that
Yeah.
hard to imagine.
Yeah. And I think that question, whether people are aware of it or not, bubbles up often in conversations because they'll say, like, oh, well, when you get to heaven, all of the trauma of your life has been removed and you don't have any of those bad memories and you're not, like sad or X, Y, or Z. But if you take any person and remove from their memory anything that's traumatic, you're going to end up with a different person altogether.
Exactly, right? So like who am I at that point?
Yeah.
Um, I think like this is actually related to uh and I don't know where I like end up standing on this. One of my favorite arguments for like an idea of purgatory, right, is that part of our ability to like recognize ourselves in terms of our own characteristics and virtues and vices and likes and dislikes is that stuff like changes over time, and so we can sort of recognize ourselves like gradually
Hmm.
changing and becoming the kind of person who enjoys something. um, right, you can become over time the kind of person who really enjoys charity. You can't wake up tomorrow and be the person who enjoys charity if you don't already,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That requires like a fundamental alteration of who you are
Right.
that would make it really hard to like recognize yourself. And so some of the arguments that I hear for something along the lines of an idea of purgatory is that it's a kind of gradual change, right? That keeps an individual personality intact, right? While becoming the kind of thing that would actually, you know, want to be in heaven.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really really fascinating. I mean, because I think about those gospel texts about the refiner's fire, right, and that
Right.
idea of burning out the impurities. And again, if you burn out the impurities, will the substance, will the thing, the being or whatnot, recognize itself? But to wrestle with the idea of purgatory, being that idea of self-realization as we are changing for this greater good, um, that's really interesting. I mean, what would that process be open to everybody? You know what I mean? Because that's one of those things, right? Like it's the Socrates problem, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have a body, then we can't punish the people in our own minds who we want to. If everybody is offered this, refining process, then suddenly it takes away our ability for the 70 whatever years we got to sit there and be like, you're going to get it one day, man. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, like, yeah, I'm a little concerned about using conceptions of the afterlife as like a present weapon. Um,
Yeah. No,
right.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Um, yeah. So I mean, like, I think there is something there where we do indulge in that idea that like, oh man, you are going to get it one day, or like, this would be a part of like your process of change or something that won't be a part of mine.
Right.
um right. And like, again, we've sort of been floating around the topic of like spirits and bodies the
Yeah.
whole time, right? So thinking about like what it is that is changing, right, or being prepared for the kingdom of heaven.
Mhm.
um like, it's really hard to imagine what that is
Yeah.
without some conception of like embodiment,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? um
Hmm.
yeah.
Well, we've talked a lot about, especially this Christian idea of you die and you're in the place, and then you're waiting for the last day that gets you to the place you're already at. I'm kind of the top tier of the Christian dual output for afterlives. But if we
Yeah.
think about the bottom tier of that, if we think about that hell reality, um, there's I forget. I was reading this article, and the basic idea was our assumptions that eternal punishment lasts forever, right? So we assume that there's this eternalness of the soul, or the eternalness of the spiritual body. We see these words about a lake of fire in the New Testament and Old Testament. Thus, your eternal soul must be forever in the lake of fire, and therefore you will forever be in that punishment.
Yeah.
You know, um, However, thinking both about the idea of like purgatory as a time of refinement, and also the reality of that, the afterlife we have when we die versus the afterlife that we're moving to with the event. If we rethink the punishment side of that, I mean, if you throw a dead raccoon in a fire, the raccoon, as a changing substance, will burn up, and that fire will keep going.
Yeah.
So there could be that reality that when someone who's on the evil side of the spectrum dies, that refinement process, instead of taking them on the upper track, once they burn, and they're gone, right? And then it's they cease being, which from an Old Testament theology kind of way, like that's the worst reality ever. The fact that you are outside of God's thought, that you're outside of God's awareness, that you are burned and you are done and you are forever there.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
Um, Which, I mean, wasn't it Socrates who's like, well, either either you're asleep and you don't know it and fine, or the spirit moves forward. So either way, it's a win-win.
Yeah, so at the end of the apology, when he's sentenced to death, right, he has this argument that philosophers like don't fear death, right? Um, and they don't fear death because like you don't know what's coming, and apparently like fear only makes sense if you like have an object. Um, which is great that Socrates didn't experience crushing anxiety. Um, but right, so the idea is like if you don't know what death is, it doesn't make sense to fear it. And like from what we've heard, from the poets and the myth makers and all this, decent people do all right. So maybe it turns out that decent people, philosophers and politicians and generally virtuous folks, go and get to hang out with the forms, the gods, or whatever, and we end up being okay. Right? So for Socrates, like death is not a thing to be feared, right? And that point gets made more strongly in the Phaedo when he argues, right, that like the soul is in fact immortal. Philosophers are best prepared for the immortality of the soul because philosophers are totally unconcerned with their bodies, which I know a bunch of philosophers is just false.
Right. I think that, yeah, that's the huge difference, especially even broad stroking Old Testament and New Testament. The fear of death is that death puts you outside of that reality of God, right? Like that's where that is. It's scariest,
Yeah.
So,
the sort of like absolute non-being.
Right. Yeah. Isn't it great to have conversations that like we will never get to a answer to until we figure out if it's a comedy or a tragedy?
Yeah. I mean, it's what we do.
It is what we do. Well, hey man, thanks so much for spending some time with us and just kind of getting the gears turning. And I find one of the weirdest parts of the social distancing is missing the conversations that you have in groups, whether they're your knitting group or your game group or whatever the case may be. So thank you so much for your time in this conversation. I appreciate it greatly.
Hey, thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, man. Hey, take care and be well.
You too.